this panel discussion will be moderated by Professor Naim Kapucu, another colleague of mine from the University of Central Florida. And the floor is yours, Professor Kapucu.
Thank you very much, Professor Öztürk, and thank you everybody else who organized this symposium. And happy to see several familiar faces on the Zoom, and good to meet with so many new ones as well. As Professor Öztürk mentioned, my name is Naim Kapucu. I'm a professor at the University of Central Florida within the Department of Public Administration, as well as within the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. My task is quite easy for today. Excuse me. I will be the moderator, introducing the speakers and facilitating some questions and answers. We are about 7-8 minutes late in the program, and I will ask each presenter, excuse me, it's morning in the US. I had my coffees already, but so I will ask each presenter spend about 20-minute presentations. We will have about 5-minute discussion after each question and clarifications. And I assume we'll have a bit more time before end of the panel to have more discussions targeted to all the presentations. Our first presenter in the panel, Dr. Maesse, I hope I didn't butcher the last name, is a professor in General Comparative Society, Institute of Sociology, and his research are primarily on discourse analysis of economists, as well as economic sociology and sociology of science and education and political economy. His presentation today is on post-neoliberalism in Europe, how economic discourse has changed through COVID-19 pandemic. Jens, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my slides. Okay, can you see the slides?
Perfect.
Perfect, thank you very much. Yes, okay, today in my presentation, I want to develop the idea of crisis pragmatism, which is understood as a modality that is regulating Europe as a social space. And I will try to show that this basically modality is becoming predominant, especially through the COVID-19 crisis. The idea of my presentation is to put in context what is basically discussed as populism. And I think we can distinguish different periods. There was basically, of course, the period of neoliberal agenda starting in the 70s, and it's still going on in different European countries. Then it was followed by a period of uprising populist movements. I remember, I think Manuel Fug's paper was pretty clear on this point. There was a left-wing critique of neoliberal reform agendas and outputs, but also a right-wing nationalist populist reaction to it. And in the late 2000 years, especially through the Euro crisis, crisis pragmatism developed as a kind of post-neoliberalism, and post-neoliberalism simply means it is not non-neoliberalism, and it is not yet an alternative to neoliberalism. It is basically a modality of regulating social, economic, and political relations that is basically the outcome of neoliberalism. And today in my presentation, I want to argue and to show, also with a small empirical example, that COVID-19 crisis was basically the breakthrough of this crisis pragmatism. And I think there are 6 reasons why in today's Europe neoliberalism finally collapsed after COVID-19. First of all, the rise of China as economic partner, technological competitor, and systemic rival. Second, the Brexit populism, which was from a European perspective a shock experience, and it was also changing political majorities in the EU at the expense of German economic liberalism. There was also the ambivalent experiences with crisis management since 2009. There is, of course, the climate change is a new challenge for Europe. There is a permanent trouble with a dysfunctional Maastricht system since the 90s. It was an ongoing transformation of the Maastricht logic until today, where it was finally removed. And of course, since the 90s, we experience a changing production chains in Europe, and the neoliberal competition state was no longer a usable concept in order to govern, to control, and to further develop this a new European economy. In my presentation, I will, in the first step, very quickly present my approach, and then I will make a comparative discourse analysis of 2 EU documents on Italy, so the so-called European semester. Then I will discuss the results, and finally I will present elements of crisis pragmatism, and I will also discuss how this relates to populism. My analytical approach is based on 4 different levels. First level is the world economy, the second level are institutions, then networks, and finally discourses. The world economy is defined as a geo-economic structure that regulates unequal distribution of economic, social, and cultural capital between regions and social classes. Institutions, in contrast, are modalities of fixing and routinizing social practices over time in order to reduce contingencies and to fix power relations. Networks are understood as social connection between experts, media, politicians, and business people that regulates basically the circulation of ideas. And discourses are defined as linguistic and cognitive structure of cultural artifacts, such as texts, also reports, that regulates interpretation processes between actors and institutions. And in my today's presentation, I will only touch 3 of these levels, and I will analyze in more detail only the discourse level. If you are interested in a detailed reading of my discourse analysis, I recommend to you the paper, which is open access, and you can easily get it, but I can also send it to you. My discourse analysis is based on 2 reports, 2 so-called EU country reports on Italy. In that case, the first is was published immediately before the crisis started in February 2020. And the second report, the so-called Council recommendations, was published in the when the crisis officially was accepted as a crisis. Yeah, so the crisis basically appeared in between these 2 reports, which are part of an institutional structure of the European Union governance system. In my discourse analysis, I will elaborate 3 different features. First, discursive temporality. Second, discursive authority, and finally, discursive ethos. And I will compare these 3 different discursive structures with the old, the pre-COVID-19 order, represented by the first document, with a new post-COVID-19 order, represented by the second document. What I want to show is basically that 6 different discourse structures help people, especially in institutions, in national, but also in European institutions, to perceive the political economy and to intervene into what is called political economy. Let's start with the first case, the EU country report on Italy from February 2020. So the first feature is what I call discursive temporality. And with discursive temporality, it is basically a very, very typical feature of every economic expert discourse. The economic temporality or discursive temporality provides people with an apparatus of economic categorization and evaluation. And this economic apparatus of economic categorization and evaluation is organized on a timeline from yesterday, today, and the future, which is very, very typical. The second typical feature for European documents in the era before COVID-19 are 2 authorities. One is basically GDP, and the other one is debt. And these authorities are always competing authorities. They allow people to speak in the name of a certain aspect, in that case GDP or debts, in order to to promote certain concepts, to promote certain reform agendas, or even to punish countries, right? And a third characteristic of European Union documents are what I would call professional objectivity, which is the ethos of technocracy. Yeah? So this kind of subjectivity, which is represented by the texts, are a modality that allows people, and in that case the authors, to speak in a certain way. And what we see always is a form of professional distance, professional objectivity. So what has changed? And when we look at the second report, the Council recommendations from May 2020, then we see significant changes. First of all, that is now the system of discursive temporality is replaced by a logic of crisis deixis. What does it mean? A crisis deixis is basically, the deixis is a strategy that refers to the point of here and now. And what we see in the documents, there's always the crisis creates a point of here and now. So the system of temporality is more or less in crisis, is replaced by the idea that the crisis is always here and always here and always here, which is a very interesting feature. Second, the discursive authority is now represented by kind of a crisis as a master signifier. So even GDP and debts are, they move down to the system of categories and evaluations. And the only authority that is basically, that allows people to evaluate the economic space of Europe is the crisis. The crisis, either the crisis exists or not. And every other economic category is basically put on one line. And the final characteristic of the post-COVID-19 situation in discourses is a switch from professional objectivity of the technocrats to emotional investments. So these technocratic discourses, what I would call the hysteria of technocracy, is what we see is a much more emotional evaluations of certain aspects of the political economy. So disrupting, threatening, negative, serious, major. These are words which are normally not used by technical discourses. So what are the consequences of these strategies? So let's go now from step by step from one level to another level. We start with the discourse level. And what we see here is basically a change in the discourse structures of the way how the economy is seen by European institutions. So what we learn is basically the way how economic expertise perceives the EU economy and the economic policy has changed dramatically. And to relate to populism, I would say there is now no space for populism, because the crisis as a kind of external element is removing all the existing or authorities from the primary stage of discourse production. But we can also have a look at the second level of institutions. Now there is an additional level that I add to my analysis. Of course, there was a dramatic change also in European institutions. So the European semester was rearranged completely, but also a couple of new institutions emerged. So rescue packages were adopted to the needs of the corona situation. The so-called Kurzarbeitergeld or short-time allowance was established as a global model in all countries, even beyond Europe. There was a big investment fund the first time in the EU. EU taxes were introduced. Transnational economic consciousness appeared, so people became aware that European supply chains exist and not national supply chains. And of course, the role of the ECB as a crisis manager was once again confirmed. And the conclusion is EU economic institutions were further developed, and some of them have changed significantly. And I think this is a problematic situation for populism, because institutions are able to adapt to new situations. And finally, so what is going on the level of the European world economy? This is a concept that I use from Fernand Braudel and Wallerstein. What is going on the level of the world economy? I think this is an interesting thing that the corona crisis led and will lead to basically a deepening, a perpetuation, and intensification of existing structural imbalances within the EU world economy. So we can see it basically in terms of crisis rescue packages. The strongest country, basically, that in that case, Germany, the biggest country, but also the economically strongest country, has used the most many measures, was able to mobilize many measures to manage the crisis. But also in terms of social inequality, low-income people struggled more with the crisis than middle and high-income people. The crisis, the world economy is also characterized by a deepening of existing tendencies. So the Brexit led, in combination with Corona, to collapse of the UK economy. This is now intensified. Even if Brexit was complicated enough, now that it comes, in addition to that, Corona. The crisis of the North Italian industrial structure is perpetuated. The understratification of Central and Eastern European industrial suppliers is solidified. And of course, the Southern European tourism sector, which is very important for many countries in the south of Europe, is in deep crisis. And here's some data that would support these evaluations. And the conclusion is the European world economy has not changed at all. Instead, we observe an intensified past dependency and further splits and fissures among European regions, classes, and sub-economies. And this is very supportive for populism. So to conclude, what are the elements of crisis pragmatism? First, economic experts speak in the name of crisis as authorization device and take measures that do no longer follow a clear economic theory. This is a very interesting observation, especially with respect to the discussion of neoliberalism that always exists and so on. Second, institutions change constantly. There is no institutional past dependency and continuity possible anymore. So institutions are able to adapt to new situations, which is also part of this pragmatism. National societies become disembedded and re-articulated along post-national spaces of inequality. So new forms of inequality emerge next to class inequalities on the class level. We see an emerging and intensification of inequality on the level of geography, which is very interesting, especially when we talk about European Union as a kind of a quasi-state. And the structures of the European world economy constantly creates new crisis events, which opens up spaces for new forms of populism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maesse, for a very comprehensive presentation. I see a couple virtual hands. I'll go with Alex Klein first.
No, sorry, that was just applause. That was
Okay.
the applauding hand sign. That was not the I have a question sign. Sorry.
All right, I appreciate it. That's virtual hands for the presentation first. Questions, comments, or feedback?
Yes, I have one question.
Go ahead.
In your opinion, is the suspension of the Maastricht criteria definitive, or will they be applied in another form with the end of the pandemic?
In my view, it is the discourse is when the Corona crisis is over, then we can think about reestablishing the old Maastricht criteria, the Maastricht criteria of 2019, yeah, in this form. This is basically the main definition. So what is needed is somebody to declare the crisis is over, and this is I can't see somebody who would do that. There must be a consensus in Europe on the crisis is over, which I cannot see, even if the crisis is over. And if they declare the crisis is over in 5 years or 10 years or 2 years, then there is a big debate among economists from different camps of the theoretical and political and ideological views that they must be reformed, and the idea is either we remove them at all, or we make a reform of the useful concept of Maastricht, and yeah, this is what I see.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments? So I can just make a quick comment. I especially was interested in the impact on networks as someone that does study networks and network governance perspectives. I'm curious in terms of your plans for potential impact and policy solutions. Are you interested in working with others? So those are the impact, and some of them are negative impacts. What are some potential solutions? Are you interested in those too, or just you want to identify the issues and others can address potential solutions?
This was a comment, yeah?
What's that?
It was difficult for me to understand you because there's a...
The comment was, so you found some interesting challenges and major issues because of COVID-19. My question to you was, are you working with practitioners in the field or policy scholars in the field in answering so what and what is next kind of questions?
Yeah, so I'm looking empirically. I'm doing interviews with economists. We are doing interviews with economists from universities, but also from think tanks. And there is a constant feedback from the field, basically on the one hand. But we also plan now a new project on think tanks of Europe and on Europe, and this will be basically hopefully answer the network part, especially when it comes to discuss, well, are there now expert networks on the European level, which would be interesting in order to understand how the Europe as a social space is stabilized in the future. So I don't see a crisis. I see much more stabilization processes going on right now, especially through the crisis, because the crisis allows, it's like a shadow. It allows people to create new relations, and while others look to the crisis all the time. And this is basically what is going on in Europe.
Great, thank you. You might have a very quick question before we go to the next presentation, if there is any. Hearing none, again, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. And next presentation is by Dr. Brett Meyer. Is a research fellow at Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and his expertise are around global populism and voting behavior in advanced democracies. He also has interest on minimum wage policy as well as negative impact of economic polarization for labor market politics. And his presentation today is on an analysis of populist leaders' responses to COVID-19. Dr. Meyer, the floor is yours.
Hi, so thank you for inviting me. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's look at that. Can you see my presentation? Anyone? I can't hear you, you're on mute.
Yeah, we can see.
You can see it? Okay, good.
Just make it full screen, please.
I'm sorry?
You might want to make it full screen.
Yeah.
There you go.
Good, okay, let's get started. Okay, so this presentation sort of recalls the first section of this conference today, and it's on how populist leaders, basically how they performed during COVID. So I'm going to cover a few different topics, the types of policies they pursued, how they did in terms of cases and deaths, and also how the pandemic affected support for populists. So let's start with the big picture here. This is these are data that we put together at the Institute. We have a populist empowered database that we update every year, and it's basically we code leaders as populists. And we found that during the last year in 2021, I just updated the database last month, we had the biggest decline in the number of populist leaders ever, down from 17 to 13. So biggest one-year decline and back down to its lowest level since 2004. Now, so you look at this and you might think, well, that's the biggest decline ever is during COVID. Now, of course, there was also a slight decline in the years before. So I wouldn't say that we can say for sure that it's due to COVID, but it certainly gives something to investigate here. And indeed, some of the early reactions to the pandemic with respect to populists are that this is going to be a really bad thing for populist leaders. So the populist revolution may become a victim of COVID. COVID is going to kill off populism. We are seeing headlines like these in pretty big places during those opening weeks of COVID. And I mean, I think this is certainly to the audience here, but even maybe a bit more broadly, this is something that was kind of sensible, right? Because when we think about populist leaders, well, what are they? Well, one of the things they advertise themselves as is they're anti-establishment. So we don't need the experts. We can rely on the will of the people. We listen to them, and that's all you need to do good governance. And politics is often more about show than substance for them. Of course, they wouldn't say this, but this is something that people at least have a lot of sense of. Specifically in health policy, there's little concern for that. This is not an area that they really discuss. And it's not that all populists do bad in a crisis, but this is really the wrong kind of crisis for populists. A pandemic is the kind of crisis where we want the health experts to come out and tell us what to do because we don't know what to do, and we want the kinds of politicians who are going to listen to them. So this was not looking like it would be a good crisis for populists. Well, okay, so this is my job to investigate stuff like this. So what do I do is I'm like, well, let's see, we only have 18 of these guys in our database. So that's, a small enough sample that I can just read about them individually. So I published a report in August 2020 where I just looked at how populist leaders, all the populist leaders had been responding to the pandemic during those first few months. So what were their initial reactions? I mean, a lot of the headlines that, populists are doing poorly in the pandemic, they're focused on Trump and Bolsonaro, who were two populists who had downplayed COVID. But what about the other 16? So I looked into this and I found that actually only 5 of 18 populist leaders around the world had downplayed COVID during these early months. But of the other 13, the ones who had taken it seriously, I still found some differences in responses. Most of those responded similarly to non-populist democratically elected leaders, listened to experts, same kind of policies. 5 of 13 took what I called illiberal responses. So involving things like very punishing lockdowns. If you remember those first few months in India, there was, Modi basically put a stop on all travel, which is a big problem in India because there's a lot of internal migration for work, so people couldn't get home. Excessive emergency powers in some countries, biased enforcement where there's more cracking down on political opponents for violating COVID protocol than supporters. So things like this. And I had this table in my piece. This just goes through who was in each of the categories. Probably not surprising. I'd note that I classified Lukashenko and Ortega in Belarus and Nicaragua as having downplayed COVID. They certainly did, although you might quibble with the fact that we classify them as populists. Basically, we do that. I mean, they're certainly dictators now, but we classify them as populists because they were elected in free and fair elections as populists originally, and they've been in power ever since. So we continue to code them as populists till they fall out of power. Again, the illiberal ones on the bottom, this is probably not too surprising a list for many of you. Okay, so that was a bit on populist leaders around the world in the sort of first few months of COVID. I wanted to look a bit further into what was going on with populist parties in Europe, because at least in Western Europe, and this was my focus in the second report from early last year, there aren't any populist leaders in power. Well, except in Italy. I didn't focus on Italy. I focused on, Northern and Western Europe. But of course, you have a lot of right-wing populist parties. So I wanted to see how they responded. And I found that, like most populist leaders around the world, they took COVID pretty seriously. I mean, in some cases, like with Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, they were criticizing their governments for not doing enough in the early weeks of COVID. And they, Marine Le Pen, used this to play right into her, ongoing narrative of, we need to close the borders, we need to reduce globalization. If I had been in power, none of this would have happened. I'm not the only one that found populists across Europe took COVID pretty seriously. Kasmude and his graduate student Jakob Wandries also found that populist leaders across Europe, so in Eastern Europe, they implemented similar policies to non-populists. So this is another report I did. I also looked at this in 2021. I wrote a blog post for the LSE where I looked at, sort of with more perspective, where I can actually collect data on this, how populists differ from other types of leaders in terms of their policy stringency. So this is the Oxford Index of, basically the seriousness of policies to respond to COVID. And then also to get at this idea of illiberalism, pandemic democratic violations. These are data from VDEM And like usual with data from VDEM, it includes a lot of different stuff. But so I investigate, first of all, populace, all populace, the total sample, no real difference in, policy seriousness. But this masks some interesting heterogeneous effects, if you will. I then broke down populace into how they responded in the first, few weeks of COVID, the ones who downplayed it, the ones who were serious but liberal, the ones who were serious but illiberal. And I found very different policy responses. So the ones who were serious but illiberal, even through summer 2021, we still find that they have, higher policy stringency than all other types of leaders. Whereas the ones who downplayed it, again, they are still overall downplaying it relative to other types of leaders. The results on the right, probably a little bit less surprising, that populists would engage in more democratic violations during COVID. So this involves a lot of the stuff that I talked about on the previous slide about, excessive emergency powers, biased crackdowns, things like this. Yelling at the media is another thing that VDEM includes in these data. So yeah, not surprising that a lot of populists had more of these during the pandemic. Okay, so that's the first few months of COVID. So how did populist leaders, how did their responses evolve? So if you remember, the first wave of COVID was mostly in Western Europe and the Americas. Even Eastern Europe didn't really get hit by the first wave of COVID. And this created a false sense of security, among populists in Eastern Europe and Asia, but really among a lot of leaders around the world. Across Africa, there are pretty relaxed attitudes toward COVID, and there have been since not too long after it started. But the second wave then came and hit Eastern Europe very hard, and since then it's had some of the highest case and death rates in the world. And then the third wave in winter and spring of 2021 hit South and Southeast Asia very hard, and especially India. And I went on Fareed Zakaria's show on CNN last May to talk about all of this, and the occasion for it was because India had been hit so hard by COVID, and there were a lot of questions about how Modi was handling things. He had relaxed restrictions for religious gatherings and for political rallies among his supporters, which many thought was a bit ironic in light of his earlier crackdown on Muslims earlier in the pandemic for violating a COVID protocol. So at this point, again, this is in the same piece that I presented the data on the policy stringency and democratic violations earlier. So summer last year, I looked at how populists were doing in terms of cases and deaths. And so again, all populists, and then I broke it down by downplay, liberal, and illiberal, the three types from the early COVID responses. And overall, I found it's, whether you'd call it a small effect, I don't know, 1,000 deaths per month more, is that a small effect? That's something. It's, marginally significant, so it's a bit noisy. And we find that this positive effect is driven by populists who downplayed COVID and those who were serious but illiberal. And this is interesting because if you remember on the previous slide, I showed that the populists who were serious but illiberal had taken more stringent responses. So they had, greater lockdowns, this kind of thing. Yet they still had more deaths than other types of leaders, which is very interesting. The coefficients are statistically insignificant, but the difference between this insignificance and statistical significance is probably, to paraphrase Andy Gelman, statistically insignificant. So yeah, some evidence of a positive relationship there. Okay, so now on the sort of other side of this, how did COVID affect support for populists, right? So, this is another thing. You look at Donald Trump, he lost the election. I think a lot of people thought he lost the election because of COVID. I investigated this a few times as well. First, in fall of 2020, I looked at support for different types of parties in Europe over the first few months of COVID. So this is for 9 Western European countries. And I broke parties down into 4 types. So one, the lead party in a coalition government, so like Merkel's CDU, then also other parties in a coalition government, then mainstream parties not in government, and then finally right-wing populist parties, or as we call them, cultural populist parties, none of which were in government in the 9 countries that I looked at. And so what I expected to find was a general boost of support for all mainstream parties at the expense of populist parties. That isn't really what I found. The main thing I found is that there was a big boost in support for the lead party in government, but that was it. Other mainstream parties did not benefit from COVID. It's true that the right-wing populists took the biggest hit from COVID, but as you see here, by fall 2020, at least in these 9 countries, this had already kind of declined. So I interpreted this in this blog post that I wrote as sort of a rally around the flag or rally around the leader, but it was specifically rallying around the leader and the leader's party, not, you know, all parties in government, and certainly not all mainstream parties. And then I've examined this again more recently. In fact, very recently, this piece was just published in one of the LSE blogs at the end of last month. So I wanted to expand my sample and look at a broader range of countries over a longer period of time, how support for leaders was affected by COVID. Because again, Trump struggled. He lost further support among white college educated people, lost support in the suburbs, and this is probably why he lost. Bolsonaro appears likely to lose to Lula coming up this year. But again, like I found, a lot of populist leaders took COVID seriously. So did they lose support too? And so what I did is I wanted to get, pretty regular polling data. So monthly, weekly polling data. These aren't available as far as I know for, all leaders around the world. So I used this for just for Europe, and I looked at 24 European countries. So this time, both Western and Eastern Europe. And so here's what I found. So the top panel here, the blue line is support for, all parties in government that are populist, that have a populist leader. And if we see this before the pandemic kicks in March, April 2020, populist-led governments are actually have higher support than non-populist-led governments. But this immediately flips with COVID. And then it remains the opposite throughout COVID, that non-populist-led governments are more popular than populist-led ones. It flips back at the end, but at this point, several populist leaders had lost in Eastern Europe. And the next 2 panels here, figures 4B and 4C, plot for populist-led governments and non-populist-led governments, respectively, how they polled against death rates in those countries. So the red lines in both of these graphs are the death rates, and the blue line is the support for that type of government. And as we see in the bottom panel here, when we got the first death spike, non-populist government support went up. So that's consistent with what we saw a few graphs back with the boost for leader parties in Western Europe. Whereas populist-led governments, they didn't get any kind of boost during the first death spike. In fact, we see a gradual decline after that. And then with the second death spike, again, a bit more of a decline, not a sharp decline ever, but a gradual decline. With the non-populist-led governments, we get this first spike in support, and then it just kind of stays at a high level. Again, doesn't really change with the second death spike. So, the most striking thing in this graph is the non-populist-led government increase in support with the death spike. But then after that, the interesting thing is just like the difference in the trend overall between populist and non-populist. Populist, gradual decline throughout, non-populist boost, and then stays at a relatively high level. Okay, so what do we take from this? What do we expect that the consequences of COVID will be for populism? So I've written about this in a report updating our data set that came out at the beginning of last month. You might interpret this as a sort of flight to seriousness during events like a pandemic, right? Where, again, like I mentioned in an early slide, there's increased support for establishment politicians because they're the ones that we see as following the advice of the experts, and that's the kind of thing that we want in this uncertain environment. And but of course, populists did worse even when they took COVID seriously, which is a bit puzzling. But you might interpret this, and I certainly can't uniquely identify this explanation with any of my data, but you might think of this as, in these sort of heightened times like a pandemic, people just may become more likely to be tired of such types of leaders, even if they don't do a bad job with COVID per se. If they do a bad job with something else, your patience is running out for this kind of leadership. And so we might think that this is part of the reason why populists immediately start to lose support when the pandemic hits, even though a lot of them took it seriously. Going forward, I'm a bit skeptical that COVID per se is going to have much of an effect on populism going forward. Perhaps if mainstream politicians push excessive lockdowns. I mean, there's been some backlash to this, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States. It's unlikely to be a major issue, although, we do have issues with vocal minorities who are, linked to populists, like we're seeing with this ongoing issue with the Canadian truckers. Populists could benefit from the turmoil of a hard economic landing if there's something like interest rate increases. But that's not really, I wouldn't say that that's an effect of COVID per se. And the research on crises and populism has found that populists benefit from financial and banking crises, not from general economic downturns so much. So I think a bit more interesting is to think about, COVID aside, what do populist prospects look like going forward? And especially, how might the opposition counteract populism? Or how might they get some of these leaders out of power? Well, they have one thing working in their favor, I think, which is that a lot of these populist leaders have been in power a long time. And I mean, in the beginning, they blame establishment politicians for everything that goes wrong. Well, clearly they're the establishment now. When you're in power for 15 years, there's no one else to blame. And people just get sick of leaders, populist or not. People get sick of leaders after many years of them being in power. In my report that I published a few weeks ago, I looked at these election losses in 2021, and I found that 3 of the 4 elections where a populist leader lost. The opposition parties, which of very different substantive commitments, they focused their campaigns entirely on removing the populist leader. This appeared to be successful in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Israel. And we see the same thing happening in Hungary, where there's an election coming up this year, and it's also happening in Turkey. But I think the difference between Hungary and Turkey is that, especially in Turkey, these leaders have put up much greater institutional roadblocks. So they have, I think, they have much more protection from institutions. Like, it's going to be easier for them to stay in power. There's probably also a higher chance of electoral corruption in especially Turkey. So leaders this past year who lost didn't do that. I mean, one of the things I wrote about is it was surprising. Like, no one followed Trump this past year. No one left office, kicking and screaming the way Trump did. They all kind of just left. But then there's a further issue. If it takes, an ideologically disparate opposition uniting to dislodge populists, what chance do these parties have if they form a government? I mean, it's one thing to unify to get rid of someone. It's a different thing to unify to govern. And so I write about the case of the Israeli government, which is its most diverse ever, and it's a minimal winning coalition. They have a majority of 1 seat. And they're really unified by fear that if they fail, Netanyahu's going to return. And so they're doing everything they can to prevent this from happening. And some of the things they've done, which is what I would advocate, as far as policy measures to take for these kind of governments, is you should focus on institutional changes to prevent populist retrenchment. So the Israeli coalition is pushing term limits for prime ministers and other less controversial policies. So again, the Israeli coalition is pushing a lot of less controversial social welfare measures. So that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer, for the presentation. You have several minutes for questions and comments and feedback. Anyone? Elsa? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. Again, excuse the wind if any strange noises happen. The wind is really very strong here. Why was there actually, do you think, the expectation that populists wouldn't take COVID seriously? And when they did it always play into the same kind of like populist game of, using circumstances to contribute to their cult of leadership or whatever it was?
Should I respond, or are we going to take multiple questions?
Are there other questions? might want to respond to this one until we wait other questions.
Yeah, so I mean, in the beginning, I mean, most of the headlines that I saw in those first few weeks were, yeah, this is going to be a problem for populists. And so, I mean, there were probably some people who are saying, well, they might take advantage of this. And this is kind of one of the things that I thought is there is something they could take advantage of here. Like, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? I mean, if you're a kind of guy who wants to, further entrench your power, if you like cracking down on people, well, this is a great opportunity to do that. And we did see that with some of these populist leaders that I put in my illiberal category. So yeah, I mean, I personally think, and I think a lot of people think this, that Trump missed an opportunity to act like this, to take it very seriously. And show that he can do that. And then he also gets one of the other things he wants, which is to, consolidate his power. So, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, certainly some did that. And some people noted that it would be a good idea for populists and kind of consistent with a lot of the rest of what they do for them to crack down like this.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments for Dr. Meyer's presentation? Hearing none. Oh, Naim, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I'm just wondering about how gauging the effectiveness of populist responses to COVID. How do you take account for external factors? I mean, if, for example, you're Hungary and you're surrounded by states with a high capacity, then your ability to deal with COVID is to some extent affected by the external environment around you and other states' abilities to deal with it, their ability to lock their populations down. Whereas if you're in India and you're, you're next door to Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal, your ability to deal with COVID is not going to be helped by your environment. So I was just wondering how you kind of control for those factors when you're comparing across such a range of cases.
So I guess the best answer to this is a technical one. And those results were based on regression analyses that controlled for a few additional things. So one is region, because one of the things that I wanted to pick up is like these things come in waves, but they're multiple countries within a region are affected at the same time. So I put those in. So, I mean, you'd expect the cases and deaths to be higher in Hungary when they're higher in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, other neighboring countries. And then also, I mean, another basic control is just level of development. And so those graphs that I presented with the point estimates controlled for some of these basic things, for regional fixed effects, for level of development, and then also some basic stuff about the countries like health infrastructure. There's some work by scholars at the WZB in Berlin where they put together all these data on COVID, the political and social correlates of COVID data set. And I followed their recommendations on how to do these regressions. So yeah, I tried to account for some of this.
Thank you. We might have time for just a quick question, if any. If not, we'll move to final presentation of the panel. We have Dr. Sheri Berman, Professor of Political Science, Barnard College, Columbia University. And her research include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism, and fascism, and the history of the left, and her work published in scholarly outlets, as well as others, including New York Times, Washington Post, and Foreign Policy. And her presentation today will be on the populist and non-populist governance performance during COVID pandemic and prospects for democracy in the West moving forward. Sheri, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So the advantage of going last is that some of the things I wanted to talk about have already been covered by my extremely intelligent colleagues, particularly Brett, who covered some of the same ground I wanted to cover, which is fine. I can go through that a little bit faster and then see if folks have any questions. So I start with the sort of basic observation, which was also mentioned, at least indirectly, by the previous two presenters, that sort of COVID hit as a crisis at a particularly difficult time for democracy. So since about 2010, we have been involved in what scholars refer to sometimes as a sort of period of democratic backsliding or autocratization. That is to say, we sort of reached a high point in 2010 in the number of democracies that existed somewhere around then. And in that period, over the last decade or so, we've seen more countries, sort of moving away from democracy than moving towards it. So this crisis hits at a time when democracy is already seen by many observers as being sort of somewhat imperiled, in a period of weakness, yada, yada, yada. Another way of kind of looking at this data just comes from the Bennett Institute at Cambridge University, is that satisfaction with democracy. This is different, of course, than the number of democracies or liberal democracies that exist, but satisfaction with democracy also sort of in decline over the past decades, and in particular over the past decades. Now, you'll notice, of course, that this decline is particularly prevalent in the United States. I think this is important because trends sort of tend to go together. The only places, in fact, where you don't see significant declines in satisfaction with democracy, particularly in Europe, are in the sort of smaller European countries. And I think, again, for those who know things about responses to COVID, after effects of the COVID pandemic, again, Brett and the previous presenter kind of talked about this, it's not surprising that it's in these small European countries actually where things seem to have gone relatively well. And the most obvious manifestation of this dissatisfaction with democracy, particularly in the industrial world, is, as has already been mentioned, growing support for populist parties, right? Why? Because obviously support for populism feeds off dissatisfaction with democracy, dissatisfaction with the establishment, yada, yada, yada. So as Brett, sort of pointed out at the beginning of COVID, right, there were a lot of fears that the pandemic and the crisis would accelerate these negative trends, right, would further democratic backsliding, accelerate dissatisfaction with democracy, and more particularly, right, as Brett said, it would feed the rise of populism because populists, again, feed off dissatisfaction with democracy, fear, yada, yada, yada. But this is in fact not what happened, right? We saw some violations against democratic norms and procedures during the early parts of the pandemic, but those seem to have declined over time. So places that track this, VDEM and others, did not find, in fact, any broad trend towards leaders, populist or otherwise, using the pandemic to really further erode the foundations of democracy. We didn't see an acceleration of democratic backsliding or autocratization in Europe in particular. And again, no overall increase, general increase in support for populist parties in Europe. The big exception to this, of course, is, I would say, the US, where the quality or the health of democracy did continue to decline during the pandemic, and the populist part of the Republican Party continued to grow ever stronger to the point where, again, now it is the sort of dominant part or faction or tenor in the Republican Party. But so while the pandemic didn't produce the dramatic negative effects that some people feared, more democratic backsliding, a major boost to populism, it didn't really boost the fortunes of democracy either. Most particularly, dissatisfaction with democracy remains quite high. I I would say that when looking for some things that the pandemic taught us or has revealed or has highlighted, two things kind of jumped out to me. And they're fairly common sense connections, but perhaps worth being reminded of. The first is that democratic satisfaction, satisfaction with democracy rather, is dependent on performance, right? How satisfied people are with democracy in general and with their leaders in particular depends on performance. And then the other connection that I think has been highlighted is how linked both satisfaction and performance are to this variable of trust. So let me start a little bit with performance, right? Now, democracy enjoys what political scientists refer to as systemic legitimacy. What does that mean? It means that democracy derives some legitimacy from the fact that people value it not merely for its performance or the outcomes it produces, but because they believe in its values, its tenets, its principles, and its goals, right? Democracy is important because people believe in political equality, because they believe that people have the right to choose their leaders in governments, because they believe that people have the right to have a voice in the future of their societies, right? So democracy has that, right? But performance matters, right? Performance matters a lot. Just as an aside, of course, contemporary dictatorships are much more dependent on performance legitimacy today than democracies are. There was a time in the past when certain dictatorships relied on ideology, on systemic legitimacy. During the early days of communism, for instance, surely there were people who believed in communism. Communist regimes promised to create a better, a more just world. Nobody believes that anymore. Dictatorships today, even relatively stable ones like the ones that exist in China and Russia, do not have that kind of systemic ideological legitimacy. They rely much more heavily on performance legitimacy, which is why, of course, for example, during the early stages of the pandemic, the Chinese regime was so desperate to cover up its initial mishandling of the pandemic because its legitimacy largely depends on a narrative of it being more effective than its democratic counterparts. Okay, so going back to democracy, right? So democracies are not as subject to performance-based legitimacy as dictatorships are, but performance, again, matters, right? Over time, performance is indeed linked with democratic governments. When citizens view their leaders and governments as being responsive to their needs and demands, they tend to be more satisfied with them, right? That is not a surprise, but we saw that once again very clearly during the pandemic. Again, this is just a general chart taken from that same study done by the Future of Democracy research group at Cambridge University, right? They find very strong connections between levels of satisfaction with democracy and actual crises. That is to say, when things are going bad, right, and democratic leaders and governments seem unable or unwilling to deal with problems, satisfaction with democracy goes down, right? So during the Euro crisis, during the refugee crisis, yada, yada, yada. And this proved, again, I think Brett talked a little bit about this, true during the pandemic, right? Leaders that seem to react to the crisis decisively, clearly, effectively, rationally, so on, were generally rewarded, right? Satisfaction with democracy went up, and these leaders' personal, support also improved, right? We saw that in places like Germany, Merkel, Scandinavia, blah, 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 right? So then the question becomes, why were some leaders better able to respond to this crisis or viewed by their populations as more responsive to the needs of their populations than others? And here, one thing that some folks have highlighted is the importance of trust, right? Now, again, obviously lots of things going on here, especially when we're dealing with perceptions of leader and government effectiveness. But, one study, for instance, these graphs are a little busy, but probably you can, or hopefully you can see the trend, right? One study recently published in the Lancet found that when citizens were more trusting both towards their government institutions and towards fellow citizens, right, pandemic outcomes were better. Pandemic outcomes being things like, sort of number of deaths, number of people in hospitals, yada, yada, yada. Why? Well, I mean, we can pretty much guess why that is. In societies that are more trusting, people are more willing to comply with rules, mask wearing, social distancing. You had higher levels of vaccination, more willingness in general on the part of individual citizens to sacrifice for the common good, right? Because you trust politicians to be doing the right thing, because you trust your fellow citizens to do the same, right? So this trust has this kind of feedback effect that enables governments and leaders to do better, and in turn, that helps to build the kind of virtuous cycle that leads to better outcome, right? So again, this one study, for whatever it's worth, and again, these kinds of, sort of assessments are obviously, they're more precise than they probably should be, right? This one study found that if citizens of every nation trusted their government as much as the Danish do theirs, or had Danish do theirs, yeah, we estimate that there would have been 13% fewer coronavirus infections globally. If the same were true for interpersonal trust, the reduction would be even larger, of about 40%. Yeah. Now, again, notice here that the US is anomalous, right? Here, levels of trust are very low. Levels of trust have plummeted in the United States from their highs in the, early 1960s, when 4 out of 5 Americans reported trusting the federal government institutions, and now we are down to a pathetic, less than 1 in 5, right? And this unwillingness, or this inability to trust leaders, politicians, experts, government institutions, directly reflected, obviously in the way the pandemic played out in the United States, right? Which is to say, people very resistant to following rules, very suspicious of what leaders and experts said. The politicization of vaccines in the United States, obviously a tragic correlate of this as well. So let me just end with a few words about the contemporary situation, right? I'm sure all of you read the news, otherwise why would you bother to come to a symposium like this, right? You know that there have been protests in places like Canada, Germany, France, and elsewhere. And to some degree, this is obviously a reflection of, what we might call pandemic fatigue, of people just being tired of dealing with COVID, and of governments not having clear plans for how to get out of this crisis, for what the end game for COVID should be. And again, studies show that the higher the levels of self-reported pandemic fatigue, sort of measured as the perceived subjective burden of dealing with the pandemic, the more people have grown dissatisfied with their governments and even with democracy itself. And so what I would say here is that even in places where governments were initially perceived to have handled the crisis relatively well, where compliance was high, places like Germany and Canada, for instance, I think what we're seeing now, toward 2 years or more into the pandemic, is that there's still, even in societies with relatively high levels of trust, relatively high levels of compliance, there is a lot of danger involved when restrictions on freedom go on for a very long time, right? So, whatever your politics are, whatever your view of the pandemic, these kinds of things had an obvious logic during the early stages of the pandemic. We didn't know exactly what was going on, and we didn't have vaccines. But over the long term, these kinds of restrictions on individual freedom can have very obvious, very serious negative political consequences. What we've seen in places like Canada is that they can trigger right-wing fears of restrictions on freedom distrust of the authority, right? We've seen this to a much greater extent in the United States, obviously, where these right-wing attitudes and fears are much more prevalent, right? And again, you know, the most obvious and tragic consequence of this, right, is the distribution of vaccination rates in the United States between red and blue America, right? The larger the support for Trump, the less high are the vaccination rates, and the higher over the last year or so have been the death rates, right? This is tragic, right? This should not be something that's politicized, but it is, yeah? I also want to note, though, that these restrictions have had negative effects, not just on the right, where I think they're most obvious and dangerous, but also on the left. So this is one poll, and I would stress, and I think probably, again, anybody who's here recognizes that any particular poll should be taken with a grain of salt, right? Depends on how the questions are asked, it depends on the methodology, and it depends on who's doing the poll, right? However, for many of us living in left-wing bubbles, a lot of these attitudes will not be shocking to you, right? Numbers of Democratic voters that at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, are willing to support, go along with extremely severe, not just continued restrictions on freedom, but with punishment for people who disagree with them, I think we should all recognize is at the very least extremely problematic. And again, after 2 years of dealing with this in the United States, which is admittedly, as I've stressed, anomalous, I think we have to recognize, again, the dangers that are involved, even when governments, for legitimate reasons, take quite extreme measures, right? And so, you know, we don't want to end up in a situation, I think, where we are testing what the long-term implications of these kinds of government restrictions on freedom are for the health of democracy, for hardening views on the left, and of course, for further triggering, I would say, populist attitudes on the right and dissatisfaction with democracy overall. So, you know, at the end, hopefully, of this crisis, I think one thing that we should maybe as analysts or scholarly observers of politics want to turn our attention to, as we now know, as my previous colleagues have pointed out, you know, some of the impact of the crisis itself during the crisis on things like populism, you know, sort of the EU, whatever. But now, as we're reaching the end, I think our attention should turn to what some of the long-term consequences might be. And again, I'm concerned that in some places where we already had problems, most notably the United States, that you know, we may be seeing downstream effects on support for populist type movements and politicians, as well as for dissatisfaction with democracy overall. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berman, for the presentation. We have time for questions, comments. Dr. Milas?
I will try to make it sensible. I had a question about performance and dissatisfaction or satisfaction. You associated these two, but performance is related to expectation of the voters, of the people. If people have low expectations for a given performance, they may feel satisfied, whereas for the same performance, if they have high expectations, they will feel dissatisfied. For example, we have, I know, a leader in a country where half of the people believe that he is the best leader, and the other half of the people believe he is the worst leader ever, whereas the performance is given. So I think when we speak of dissatisfaction, we have to take performance. We have to take in consideration the expectation of the people. I don't know how we measure that, but only performance is not enough to explain phenomena, I think.
I absolutely agree with both of your points. One is, I think that, you know, measurement of things like performance is subjective in general, and as you said, sort of dependent on expectations. And in very polarized societies like the United States, obviously interpretations of performance are heavily filtered through a partisan lens. I absolutely agree with that. There's no doubt about it. I will say though that, if you look at the levels of satisfaction over time, the fact that there is a strong correlation at the very least between periods when we can obviously see crises, disturbances, whatever, Euro crisis I mentioned, the refugee crisis, when there are serious problems facing societies and people's sort of, concerns and expectations of governments being willing and able to deal with them go up, you see dissatisfaction when the perception is that hasn't happened. So look, I agree with you. And I also agree with you more generally that dissatisfaction with democracy is a very multifaceted thing. Just like I was not trying to suggest that trust alone could explain things like COVID outcomes. Absolutely not. There's lots of things going on there. But insofar as we're focused on the political aspects, right? Because that's what we're, sort of here to discuss, right? We're trying to figure out what sort of political factors influence things like, sort of ability to deal with COVID, ability to get through the crises with folks believing that their leaders and governments, were sort of doing the right thing, trust mattered. So yes, satisfaction is a multifaceted thing, multi-causal phenomenon. Things like performance are hard to nail down in any objective way and are themselves filtered through other things. But I think, we want to consider that, right? Democracy is not, I think the more general point I was trying to make, democracy is not dependent purely on performance-based legitimacy, right? But we do have to recognize over time, if citizens become increasingly convinced that leaders and governments are unwilling or unable to respond to their needs, right? Again, this is a common sense observation, but I think often one that's not taken seriously, then dissatisfaction is going to grow, right? That's almost, again, tautological. And I think that the perception that leaders and governments over time have become less responsive is something that we need to take very seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Öztürk?
Thank you very much for your perfect presentation, Dr. Sherman. What I learned from your presentation is that there is the crisis of democracy right now. The rise of authoritarianism, populism, is because of our dissatisfaction with existing democratic performance. So, but on the other hand, in the long term, maybe we cannot expect much better solutions from populist discourse, or whatever its name. That means we need some new type of governance institutions, organizations, intermediation mechanism to increase the performance of our existing democratic orders. But what kind of intermediation mechanisms, alternative institutions can be thought so that our expectation from democratic governance might be fulfilled and populist demand would be taken under control, let me say?
So that's a huge question. Let me skirt by it a little bit by just correcting one thing that you said, or rather correcting how I view one thing that you said. I'm not suggesting that the entire phenomenon of democratic backsliding or autocratization can be only explained by levels of democratic dissatisfaction, or rather I would say that in sort of older democracies like those that exist in Western Europe and the United States, democratic dissatisfaction has different causes perhaps than in newer democracies, right? Because these different types of democracies are facing different kinds of challenges, right? So insofar as we're looking at older democracies, right, places like Western Europe and the United States, I would say there the connection between democratic dissatisfaction and populism is relatively strong, although getting back to the previous question, that perception of, or where that dissatisfaction comes from, again, is sort of subjective, right? But the question of representation perhaps is important here, right? What characterizes a lot of populist leaders, or rather a lot of populist voters, and Brett has done, lots of great research on this as well, right? Is this sense of dissatisfaction, this sense that the establishment, however you want to, sort of operationalize that, is not really responsive to them. And I'm not convinced that there's not something to that, right? Often the sort of solutions that these folks advocate are not ones that I think many of us would support, but their sense that their needs and demands have not been, sort of listened to or responded to. I think that's actually, valid for a lot of these folks over the last decade or two. And we can point to obviously a whole variety of problems from, sort of rising economic insecurity, growing inequality, the sense that societies are changing in demographic and cultural ways that these folks are not comfortable with. Again, I'm not suggesting these things they're correct about that, but it's the job of politicians and parties to kind of help people deal with change, right? To make that change easier for them to adjust to. And it's not clear to me that parties and politicians have really done a great job of that over the last sort of couple of decades. And so, the sort of simplistic response to your answer, again, in the West, or rather in older democracies, is that I do think that our parties and politicians have become somewhat out of whack. They have lost the ability to both understand and therefore respond to the needs of large numbers of voters. And a lot of these voters have just gotten fed up. So, again, a simplistic answer, but one that I think resonates with what democracy is all about, which is it's supposed to be about representation. It's supposed to be about people's voices being heard and responded to, at least those, that are legitimate. And I think that, we're in a period now when we're recognizing that there is a strong disconnect between what, a lot of voters think they're getting from their politicians and parties and what they believe they need.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have maybe time for another question to Dr. Berman. Hearing none, thank you very much. And I believe Dr. Maesse is no longer with us in the room, but any final comments before we conclude, either from Dr. Berman or Dr. Meyers? No, hearing none. Again, thank you very much. This has been a very productive panel. I appreciate the presentations and questions. As someone who does research on leadership and crisis management, and recently on COVID-19, especially in the US and other parts of the world, I truly appreciate the feedback and comments and the knowledge you shared with us. With that, I will turn it back to Dr. Oester.